Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ellie Harwood, and I am the Wales Development Manager for the UK Cost of the School Day project in Wales. I work for Child Poverty Action Group, and I'll explain a little bit about the UK Cost of the School Day and about the work that we do more broadly with Child Poverty Action Group. And the aim of the session today really is just to talk a little bit about child poverty in Wales, the impact of the pandemic, what schools are going to be facing in terms of the kind of socio-economic impacts of COVID and what that's doing to the incomes of households with children, and exploring a little bit of the research that we've done with families in Wales, their experiences of education over the last 12 months. And then looking at some of the practical things that we do as part of the Cost of the School Day collaborative project, and also some sort of discussion, hopefully, about what schools can do over the next couple of years to help children to thrive following the events of the last couple of years. So I'm going to talk probably for about 35 or 40 minutes, and there'll be an opportunity then for questions and discussion. If you've got questions, do pop them in the chat as we go along, and then, as Tim said, we'll try and sort of facilitate some conversation afterwards as well. There will be a recording of this presentation and slides available for everyone, and there are links as well at the end of the presentation where you'll be able to go to our website and also find contact details for the team. So if you have any queries that you'd like to explore further, then we'll be able to talk about those as well. So to start off with, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about UK Cost of the School Day and what it is, what it does. So the UK Cost of the School Day is a collaborative programme that involves quite a large number of organisations. It was initially set up by Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland, and we've been delivering the programme there for about 7 years. And it was a partnership between the Public Health, NHS Public Health Scotland, Glasgow City Council and the Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. And the programme was initially devised as a public health intervention which aimed to maximise family income, so recognising that a lot of the issues to do with the health and well-being of the population are grounded in poverty and in socio-economic disadvantage. And one of the most effective things that you can do to improve child health and population health is to ensure that families have adequate incomes. And part of the thinking behind the project was based on research that we'd done with children and young people affected by poverty, who told us that one of the ways that poverty really affects them and holds their life back is in their experience of school and their ability to be able to participate in education alongside their peers. And it's based a lot on this one quote that came from a child that took part in some research that we did, who said that education is supposed to be free, but a lot of things at school are not. And this is a fact that is borne out in all of the education systems across the UK. We ostensibly do have schools provided for free, but it's certainly not free to attend school. And a lot of families really struggle with the everyday costs of sending their children to school. So as time has gone on, the Cost of the School Day project has expanded across the UK, and we now have quite a lot of local authorities and universities and schools, individual communities, children and young people and their families taking part. So it's kind of a very nebulous movement, I suppose, that we're aiming really to kind of work with school communities across the UK to understand how school costs can create barriers for children and families. And we work with schools and local authorities to take action to support the participation and well-being of children and young people who are growing up in low-income homes. And we do this by working directly with schools, and we provide advice, support and training. We produce resources for schools, and there are pictures on your screen of two of the resources that we've published recently. So we have a Cost of the School Day toolkit, which schools can use to take action on the cost of their school day. And then a publication called Turning the Page on Poverty. We're about to publish in May a Welsh version of the Turning the Page on Poverty toolkit, and this is something we've produced in partnership with the National Education Union. And the Welsh version will be bilingual, and it's based on case studies from schools across Wales and the actions that they've taken around reducing the cost of the school day and ensuring participation and well-being for children in poverty. So we're very interested in practice gathering and sharing, and this is about looking at what different schools in lots of different contexts have done to take action on the cost of the school day, including how they managed to minimise costs within very constrained budgets. And we're particularly interested in the project we're doing at the moment in what that looks like in different education systems around the UK. So we have an evaluation team that work alongside us from Newcastle and Durham University, and they're looking at how the Welsh education system, the Scottish education system and the English education system all address child poverty in different ways. And within Wales, we've got two areas of particular focus with that action research, which is in Rhondda and Taff and Neath Talbot. So we've been very fortunate to be doing some work with Central South Consortium and some schools and local authorities in South East Wales. But we are hoping to be able to kind of engage with schools and communities across Wales as part of this work. And we produce policy, research and advocacy publications then on the basis of our work. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we've published as well. So that's kind of the theory behind the project, really. But what we're going to focus on today is the very kind of practical aspect, really, which is hopefully to help you understand a little bit about what the pandemic has done to child poverty rates, what the picture was just before COVID-19 hit Wales, and what we think some of the issues are going to be going forward as children start returning to school. And then obviously what you as school governors need to consider in your role to ensure that children who have been pulled into poverty as a result of the pandemic, and also those who perhaps were there in poverty before and are now spending a larger proportion of their child in low income, what schools can do to really help those children. So I think it's fair to say that the pandemic has acted as a lightning bolt, really, that has illuminated the pre-existing inequalities in our society. Poverty isn't something new, and child poverty isn't something new. Wales had very high child poverty rates prior to the pandemic, but it's undeniable that for organisations like ours who work directly with families affected by poverty, that people who were having a hard time before COVID-19 are finding things even more difficult. And there are many more people now who weren't in poverty before, but have found themselves pulled down into living on a much lower income as a result of the economic impacts of the virus. So, I mean, here are a selection of headlines that kind of showcase, some of the work that we've been doing to raise awareness of how families with children have been affected. And you can see there a picture. One of my favourite people is Marcus Rashford, who's been campaigning on the issue of child poverty and child hunger. He's done more, I think, than anyone else to really, really illuminate just how difficult it is for many families with children to make ends meet at the moment. These things are not new. These issues have existed for quite a long time, but I think COVID has really allowed us to see, whereas some people have had a relatively comfortable pandemic and some households have actually managed to increase their savings and reduce their spending, particularly the case for families with children, things have got a lot tougher. And we know, that more than a quarter of families with children are living on much lower incomes than they were before the pandemic. So when we're talking about poverty and child poverty, you will hear the word used in different contexts, but there is a technical definition, and this is the one that is used by governments and policymakers, and it's also used by Child Poverty Action Group. And it just means that a household is said to be in poverty when they have an income that is 60% or less of the median income in society. So the median income is the average, is the middle, and anyone who has an income that is 60% or less of that is considered to be in poverty. And the quote on the right is from Peter Townsend, who is an academic and one of the founding members of Child Poverty Action Group. And his definition of poverty is the one that still tends to be used by most academics and policymakers. And it's quite important when you look at it, it helps you to understand what poverty actually means in practice, which is not simply that you have a low income, but it's what living on a low income does to you in relation to your ability to participate in society. So individuals, families and groups in the population can be said to be in poverty when they lack resources to obtain the type of diet, participate in the activities and have the living conditions and amenities which are customary or at least widely encouraged and approved in the societies in which they belong. So in simple terms, this means that you're in poverty when you have insufficient income or other resources to allow you to participate in a normal way in the society that you live in. So it makes it very difficult for you to join in, and it makes it very difficult for you to live at a standard that's kind of expected or accepted by others in your society. So from the perspective of a child in poverty, this means that you cannot afford to do the kinds of things that most other children can do. So it might mean that, for example, you can't afford to have swimming lessons. You might not be able to afford, you know, as we've seen very starkly in the pandemic, to have internet enabled devices in your home. You may never get to go on holiday, all of these kind of things. So, you know, you have probably what is considered a normal standard of living and a normal kind of typical childhood. And a child in poverty simply won't be able to access all of those same experiences, opportunities, and also to kind of obtain the material resources that other children might have. So, you know, within Central South Consortium, I know we've got governors coming from all over Wales, in fact, I think, to this session, but I've just focused very much on what's happening in the local authorities covered here. You know, that we have areas of very high affluence and very high levels of deprivation as well. So before the pandemic, there were 19.6% of children attending schools in the consortium were eligible for free school meals. And now the Welsh Government have said in the Senedd that they actually think that the number of children receiving free school meals may have gone up by as much as 10% during the course of the pandemic. So that's one indicator that potentially a lot of families are falling into very low income when they weren't previously. But this can also be a sign that something quite positive has happened in the pandemic, in that lots of people who may have been eligible previously but didn't claim for various reasons are now claiming free school meals for the first time. And that might be because local authorities have been offering cash payments in lieu of free school meals and making it very easy and encouraging people to apply. And this has motivated people to take up entitlements that they perhaps wouldn't have previously. So these figures here are published as part of our End Child Poverty Coalition. So every year we publish data on the rates of child poverty across the UK, and within Wales then we have a look at local authority and right down to ward level. So you'll be able to access all of this data from the presentation, and you'll be able to look at the specific wards in your school that you draw children in your intake comes from, and it will tell you what the child poverty rates are. And these figures are updated annually, and we're due actually very soon. In fact, tomorrow there'll be the next set of data released by the Department for Work and Pensions. So it's a shame really that I'm presenting today, but keep your eye out, because there'll probably be some media stories about the new figures coming out later on. And what these figures show is that the local authority in Wales with the highest child poverty rate at the moment, just before the pandemic, was actually Pembrokeshire. And then you can see they're listed in descending order of the rate. So this is the proportion of children living in homes below the poverty line in every local authority. And of course, it's important to note that child poverty isn't evenly distributed within communities. So you will have some wards that are more affluent and some where deprivation is much higher. So somewhere like Rhondda and Taff, where I live, we do have wards where the rate goes down to 15% or so, and we have other wards where it's 50%. The important thing to note is that in every local authority, at least 1 in 5 children was living in poverty just before the pandemic hit. So these are simply astonishing numbers, and what we must remember when we're thinking about the impact of the pandemic on child poverty rates is that there will be very few families who will have moved out of poverty over the last year, because the kinds of things that people normally have to do to get out of poverty is increase their hours and earnings in work, and that's been very, very challenging for people to do. So this was the picture beforehand, and we can expect in many ways that many families will be finding things even harder. So we have seen quite a big increase in the number of households on universal credit over the pandemic, but it's worth noting again that we already had a lot of families relying on some help from Social Security to make ends meet before the COVID-19 began, and the majority of families with children in Wales are still claiming what we call legacy benefits, so they're still getting tax credits rather than universal credit. And you can see with the rates here that the single parent households on universal credit has been going up fairly steadily without much of a big jump, but there's been quite a big jump in couple parent families, and that tends to show that perhaps they weren't claiming at all, and then they've had a drop in income which has made them eligible. But lots of people claiming universal credit are in work and just on a low income, so it's kind of giving you, I guess, a fairly stark picture really in terms of the amount of households with children that are having to claim benefits to top up their incomes even if they are in work, and it has gone up quite significantly over the last year. So as I mentioned, Child Poverty Action Group have been conducting research into family experiences of school closures, and we're really interested in what have been some of the barriers and some of the things that have helped families to keep learning while schools have been closed. And I think anyone involved in education will know that, again, this has been a kind of lightning bolt moment that's allowed educators just to see, for really clearly for the first time, how many families actually don't have the very basic kind of resources that you need to be able to carry out learning at home. I think the scale of digital exclusion for children and young people perhaps wasn't ever fully recognised until the pandemic began, and we suddenly needed every child to be able to get online and participate in learning from home. So we've been very interested in mapping what resources families have and what's missing, and also obviously collecting good practice and understanding what things schools can do that can help children to join in with learning at home. So this is actually the third survey that we've done in Wales, and we published the report last week. So most of these figures come from the UK level survey, but I do have some of the stats for Wales as well. And what's quite interesting is that we didn't find much difference between the experiences of low-income families in Wales, low-income families in England, and low-income families in Scotland, aside from a few things around, for example, free school meal policy. When it comes to what kind of resources are missing and what kind of challenges families are facing, they're very, very similar across the nations. And what we have found is that even when governments have put in place programmes to try and distribute laptops and so on to homes without them, more than a third of low-income families still don't have the digital resources they need to be able to learn from home, and this is based on what's happening almost a year into the pandemic. So the most common missing resources by far are laptops or access to a computer. Most homes do have a way of getting online, so they would have connectivity, Wi-Fi or some kind of dongle data device, but it's really, really common for homes to only have one digital device. And when there are multiple children, the parents were telling us they were having to just faced impossible choices about which child was going to get priority access when they might have had lessons on at the same time, or one child needs to type up and send in an assignment, you know, and the kind of managing, you know, the expectations sometimes of schools, and obviously for the children, their own desire to participate in the learning, but just simply not having the equipment that would enable them to do that. We ask all the families that we work with how concerned they are about money and how their finances are doing. And what we've found as we've done these surveys over time is that concern about money is much higher than last year. Most families have found that their spending has had to go up a lot with school closures. And it's interesting how much families on low incomes rely on schools to offset some of the costs of raising children. And it's not obviously just perhaps getting free school meals, but also, you know, providing opportunities for children to go online, providing them with software, providing them with reading books, providing them with arts and crafts materials, providing them with paper and printing and all of these things. And so, you know, a lot of families, even if they've got the equipment at home, they can't afford to put ink in the printer, or they just run out of paint and they can't afford to buy any more. But lots of people saying they're spending a lot more money on bills, and you know that perhaps they've got this double pressure then, where they've had to cut their hours in work, or they've lost their jobs altogether because schools have closed and they can no longer work, and their bills have gone up, and the children are at home and they're eating a lot more and they're heating the house all day. So lots of people finding that it was a big financial pressure not having the children in school. But the things that we found that helped, that, you know, schools have done and to make a difference, obviously, is a lot of schools have given out laptops and dongles, but also printing and paper and stationery packs and reading books, and most importantly of all, pastoral support. So many of the families that we spoke to were very isolated. They hadn't had any check-ins or support. They're not engaged with any services. You know, they're perfectly adequate parents, very loving, caring for their children. So they're not kind of, you know, having anyone checking in on them. They're not flagged as any kind of, you know, being in need in any way. But they're really, really struggling. And schools provided an amazing service in terms of actually asking parents how they were coping and checking in, making sure they were all right, attending to the emotional, you know, well-being really of the children and their caregivers as well. You know, so we really want to recognise just how important schools have been in keeping families going through this time, because they have been amazing, and there are so many fantastic stories out there, you know, and we find that schools that were quite community oriented or family focused and had those relationships beforehand obviously were better placed to be able to continue those relationships through lockdown. But there were also schools that perhaps hadn't always had such strong relationships with parents and carers in the past, that have found that the pandemic has been an opportunity to get to know children and their children's home lives and their parents a lot more, and to understand a lot more about the context that the learners are living in. And this is actually quite an asset, I think, as children come back to the classroom, because it allows for teachers to plan in a much more sensitive way about how they're going to help children you know, engage with learning going forward, and particularly in planning a new curriculum and new learning opportunities. So one of the things that I think is important to touch on, as it is PDG week, and you know, Welsh Government have made really significant investment in both the Pupil Development Grant and in the generosity of free school meals and providing support through the holidays, is looking at whether free school meals receipt is a good indicator for child poverty in your school. Now, unfortunately, I can't see or hear any of you, so if we were all in a room together, this would be a kind of show of hands type opportunity. But I guess, you know, if you just sort of take a second and think about, you know, what you know about child poverty rates in your community and about the rates of free school meal receipt in your school, and whether the two match up or not. And I'll move to the next slide. It gives away the answer to some extent, which is that we've carried out some analysis of the number of school-aged children in poverty and the number who are eligible for free school meals under the means test. And we found that more than half of children living in poverty in Wales cannot get free school meals under the current means test. This means that they're also not eligible for pupil development grant. So in an average size primary class of 25 children, there'll be 7 children who are growing up in poverty, and 4 of those 7 will not be eligible for free school meals. And this is primarily because they're in working families, which means they'll be earning too little within the household to lift them out of poverty, but slightly too much to qualify for free school meals. And under the new means test that was introduced a couple of years ago, the earnings threshold now is £7,400 a year. So you can imagine a family, perhaps with 3 or 4 children, where there might be one parent and she's only earning £9,000 a year working in care, for example, in term time only. That family wouldn't be eligible for free school meals, even though it obviously would be in quite considerable need financially. And our research has shown time and time again that it's these families in particular who struggle with the cost of the school day. So they're not able to access normally the kind of grants and help that would be available to families who do get free school meals, but they'll be living on low incomes and finding it very, very hard to make ends meet. And we know from our research that there are a very large number of families with children who fall into this bracket. So well over 2/3, we're getting on for over 70% of children in poverty live in working households. So there is someone in their home who does have a job, but they're not earning enough to move out of poverty. And these are the families that often, you know, their poverty is quite invisible. Schools might not be aware. The community might not be aware, and it's really important when we're thinking about poverty to recognise that it's not easy to identify a lot of the time. Poverty is very stigmatised in our society. It's deeply shameful for people. No one wants to really admit that they're finding it hard to make ends meet. So they're not necessarily going to be the most obvious kind of examples of people who need intervention. And that's why when we recommend taking action on the cost of the school day, we try and talk about taking whole school approaches. So we look at things where we can change the overall approach to costs and money within the schools that don't require targeting to specific pupils. And that's partly because it's very, very hard for schools to actually know who is and who isn't in poverty at any given moment. So, you know, in terms of this slide, what can we say? I could talk all day about how does poverty impact education. It affects every aspect of a child's experience of school. And there are many experts who will be able to talk about the impact on learning and what needs to be done. And Welsh Government have spent 20 years now mapping out how to close the attainment gap and the approaches that work. So, you know, there's nothing really new to say in terms of what needs to happen with teaching and learning. We have really good expertise there, and we've got, you know, I think plenty of resources that people can go to. But one aspect of poverty's impact on education perhaps hasn't been so thoroughly explored, and that is the social and relational aspect of poverty in terms of how children can participate in school. And that's what the cost of the school day does. It removes the stigma of poverty from attending school. So the illustration will show you what we would call the weight of child poverty. So, you know, it's something that a child has to carry with them when they come in through the school gates every day. And when I talk to children in poverty about their experience of school, there are very common themes, and these come out time and time again with both older and younger learners. And that will be a sense of shame, of being left out, being unable to join in, being embarrassed about the fact that their family has fewer resources, often a sense of loneliness and a feeling that school, as one child said, school is not my place. So when we reflected on what poverty actually is previously, we were looking at the relational aspect of poverty, the idea that it sets you apart from other people and it makes you, to kind of literally be placed at a lower status than others, and that subconsciously affects children from quite a young age. And we'll talk a bit about, well, what does that actually look like in terms of the school day? So these are all quotes from pupils that we've worked with and that are in our Turning the Page on Poverty resource. So in very practical terms, when you have no money and you have to go to school and things cost money, it means that you can't afford to join in. So the quote in purple there, is, well, I think if all your friends or people go to the after school clubs, the school trips, that kind of isolates you from them. You're singled out, you're not with them, just a spare person. And what we've heard through some of the poverty proofing work we do in schools is that quite often, schools can have policies that really stigmatise or single out pupils with less money. So if there is a trip happening and everyone's supposed to make a financial contribution, and some children can't, some schools will leave the pupils who can't pay behind. So the whole class gets to go off on a trip, but some kids are left behind in the classroom just with some worksheets to do and supervision. And I think when you think about, well, how does it feel to be that pupil? What does that tell you about your value and your place in the school and in wider society if you are literally being left behind because your family has less money? Poverty also can be a source of, social bullying, because we live in a highly consumerized society and brands and wealth are seen as desirable by a lot of young people and their parents as well. So, schools can do a lot to kind of reduce those issues, but it's not always fully recognised in bullying policies and so on, that bullying based on socioeconomic status can be a really big problem for young people. And the Children's Commissioner for Wales has done some fantastic research on this, and there's a link to her work at the end of the presentation, which explores, when children are asked who gets treated unfairly, there's a particularly young people really strongly recognise that having less money than others is a really strong ground for bullying and being treated unfairly. So very much worth thinking about those things. So with the work that we do across the school day, we kind of have two principles really that underpin the poverty proofing work in schools. So if you wanted to kind of think about poverty proofing your school, and the sort of the principle really is around removing stigma. So it's about making sure that if you have children or families in your school who have less money than others, that there are no planned activities that will identify, exclude, treat differently, or make assumptions about children whose household income or resources are lower than others. So it's about ensuring that there's discretion, that's equality of opportunity, that you remove cost barriers where you can, and you find really discreet and family-friendly ways of helping people meet costs where you do have to make charges. And the aim, of course, of the school day is to help all children and young people take part and be happy at school. And we work with everyone to make sure that money is never an issue. So the idea is that, it doesn't matter how much money your family has, every child gets the same chance to join in. And we do this through quite a variety of different methods, but the primary method is through consultation with children and young people about the experience of attending school. So we always say to schools who want to sort of start embarking on this type of work is, how much do you understand, first of all, about what attending your school costs? What does it cost for a parent to send their child to your school? And you can go through a process where you literally audit everything that happens in and out of the classroom. and we normally try to do it by looking at a kind of a standard day, school day, and then also through the calendar year. So when you have specific costs. So the big ticket things that most people kind of recognise, obviously, are school uniforms, school trips and school dinners. But then we need to be thinking about, well, music lessons. What if they want to do clubs? What if they want to do sports? What if they want to do all of these kind of other social aspects of school life as well? Do you insist on families buying uniform from certain branded suppliers, or do you have a uniform policy that allows people to source things from affordable retailers? Do you make it possible for people to pay for things in installments? So if they don't have large lump sums of cash, or their income fluctuates over time, that they're able to think about, paying. A lot of people find it easier to manage the cost of things like trips in installments. How much notice do you give families when you're about to make a charge for something expensive? For some families, they will have to save up for a couple of months to be able to afford a school trip. And do you think about giving people advance notice of that? When you're setting homework, what expectations do you have in terms of the resources that families have to put into completing that homework? Are you expecting them to have access to equipment and materials and time that perhaps they just don't have? And then, all the kind of fundraising activities that schools do you make it possible for families to be able to opt out? How do you collect money? Is it embarrassing for children? Are they singled out and made to feel shame because they can't afford to even donate 50p? So these are all kind of questions that in the Cost of the School Day toolkit you can work through yourselves. But we I think in terms of what governors can do, thinking about your role, obviously, as someone who's responsible for scrutinising and supporting school leadership to take action on these issues. The big questions, I think, in terms of what schools do that are really helpful is how do you support families that are struggling financially, remembering that many won't be obvious to you and they won't necessarily be in receipt free school meals, but how do you make sure that all families are getting the entitlements that they might be missing out on? And how do you understand what the experience of attending your school is like? How do you listen to the children and young people in your school? And do you listen to their parents and carers as well about how they're finding, sending their children to your school, and particularly the costs associated with that? So really thinking, how do you listen to pupil voice? What kind of working groups are available? What methods can you use? And we provide, as part of our toolkits, templates that you can use in terms of surveys and also discussion groups and so on. And I've put some questions in there, really, if you're thinking about the particular policies that you might be leading on or responsible for. So, the most obvious ones, obviously, are school uniform and then kind of charging and remissions. But it's also worth thinking about things like your behaviour, discipline policies. We find schools that might, for example, reward children for high attendance, but it's sort of worth noting that children in poverty are much more likely to miss school than children from better off homes, because they're more likely to suffer from respiratory illnesses as a result of living in damp or overcrowded housing. So, all of these things can be real barriers for children to get that 100% attendance, and it again leads to those feelings of being excluded or just feeling like you can't kind of join in, you don't stand a fair chance from the start. And of course questions then about bullying, about making sure that children aren't being made to feel unhappy or being treated unfairly because they have fewer resources